Okay, today is Sunday, April 2nd, 2017. My name is Natalia Hernandez Ochoa, and I'm interviewing Dr. Blandina, best known as Bambi Cardenas, for the Oral History Project here in Brownsville, Texas. Thank you so much for agreeing
My pleasure.
to do this interview, and just to make sure that you understand that the interview will be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection. If there is something that you don't want to talk about, you don't have to. If there is at any point you need to go to the bathroom, use the facilities, drink water, please feel free to do so. Also, if there's something you really want to talk about, please speak up. And yes, so I've prepared some questions for you today. So if you don't
Dale
mind,
gas.
I'll go ahead and start. Okay.
Okay.
So how would you like me to address you, Dr. Cardenas? Or
Well, it's Dr. Cardenas Flores.
Flores. Okay,
Yes,
Dr.
Cardenas
Cardenas
Flores.
Flores. I will
Yes.
do that.
Mhm.
So in a very short overview, can you tell us how does your life story relates to the South Texas Border Initiative? Just in general, like what was happening at that point in your life?
Well, first of all, it's interesting because I've thought a lot about that, and in the last few days when I'm not doing everything else. And first of all, I am a South Texan. I was born in Del Rio, Texas. And I was born into what was the original Salvatierra case, which was the first school desegregation case in the United States. My mother overnighted with the Salvatierra girls. My family was very much involved with the school district that was formed after that. So that's important to understand about me vis-a-vis this whole enterprise. I attended schools in San Felipe, which was a school district formed after Mexicanos seceded from the Anglo school district because of the unequal treatment they had there. So that's kind of where my DNA starts. I grew up in the 50s, in the pre-Brown v. Topeka, South Texas. My parents said to me one day, "You are going to go integrate the swimming pool." And the next day they said to me, "And you're going to integrate the library." And so at about the age of 9, I was prepped to do this. So it's kind of like everything was leading up to this. And then working with Dr. Jose Cardenas, I was part of the U.S. versus Texas litigation, which had to do with K-12 inequity in school finance. And I devoted quite a bit of my time and energy to that. I worked with him in the Edgewood School District, which was the site of the Rodriguez case. And then we did Denver versus Keys and Doe v. Plyler, which had to do with the education of undocumented children. So all of that legal / educational activity I was part of that and played a central role in the development of strategy. In fact, it was at the Intercultural Development Research Association, in discussions with Al Kaufman and Norma Cantu and others, that we were meeting over U.S. versus Texas, and we started talking about the applicability of the U.S. versus Texas theory of unequal funding to higher ed. About that time, I left San Antonio, and I went on one of my 3 stints to go work in Washington, D.C. So really the case developed. I was not part of the development of the case. I was, at the time, I was serving on the United States Commission on Civil Rights, where I served for 13 years. So I was aware of what was going on, but I was not involved in the case.
What was your main role at the beginning of the case? Like what were you doing specifically?
As I said, we were primarily working on issues of school finance inequity in the K-12 system. We had an intimate and hand-in-glove relationship with MALDEF around a lot of school equity issues. But I did not, I was not a part of the work that was done on the case because I went to Washington, D.C. at that time to, I think it was when I went to work for the American Council on Education.
Okay.
So I was not part of that. My next nexus with the case, and it's all coming back to me now, was when the coordinating board asked me to serve on a commission which had to look at issues of diversity in higher education, and in particular with meeting the goals of increasing the participation of underrepresented populations in higher ed. And then following that, about that time, I was working for the American Council on Education in Washington, D.C. The American Council on Education is the umbrella organization for higher education. And I was director of the Office of Minorities in Higher Education at the American Council on Education. So my interest in the case was, of course, central to the work that I was doing at ACE. But again, I was not part of the individuals who were either strategizing around the case or who were testifying on the case. But all of these people, well, I would say that a very significant number of the people who were involved in that had also been involved in the in issues related to financial inequity in the K-12 system.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'll let you ask me a question.
Well, I just wanted to get to know you at a personal level a little more. So if you can tell us about your experience growing up in the Rio Grande and like school system, your school
Well,
experience.
that's what's, in some ways, it was a very unique experience because, as I said, I grew up in Del Rio, where in 1929, the Salvatierra case was the first school desegregation case in the United States. The Salvatierra case was the court ruled for the plaintiffs, but the local schools found a way to get around it, and segregation ruled. And so the Mexicanos, particularly the Mexicanos in San Felipe, which was the barrio where my father's family lived, determined that they would secede from the Anglo School District and form their own. So when they did that, I wasn't born yet, but my parents were always extraordinarily aware and conscious of issues of the law and discrimination, and real champions for kids who didn't have a chance. That was the bottom line. I grew up in San Felipe. We moved into the barrio because my parents wanted us to go to school in the new all Mexicano school district. They didn't want us going in the Anglo school district, so it was kind of a an act of self-determination. And so that created a real strong sense of identity for me. But the other thing was that the kids that I grew up with were very, very poor. I grew up with very poor people. I still remember my shock as an adult when a couple of the girls said, "We always wanted to go home with you because you all had food." That's how poor the kids were. You know, come April and May, 3/4 of our community disappeared. They went to the works, se iban a los trabajos, you know, as migrant laborers. So that had a profound impact on me because I grew up knowing that they were extraordinarily bright, that they were good people. We were not by any means wealthy, but we weren't poor. My dad always had a good job, and we had a car, and you know, we were not that, we didn't live with that kind of poverty. But I came to know that the barriers that poor kids, and particularly poor Mexicano kids, had to live with, and I hated it. From the moment, I remember I must have been 5 or 6 years old when, you know, the light bulb went on, and the only thing I ever wanted to do was to change that. That was going to be my life purpose from the time I was, you know, before I was a teenager. And when other people were thinking about going off to be movie stars or going off to, you know, getting married, I thought getting married was ridiculous, you know. You needed to go be a lawyer so you could fight for justice. So that came out of the environment in which I grew up. Also, I remember very clearly and cases. Even though my parents had not very much education, I came to know that cases were important. The Hernandez case in 1948, one of the lawyers on that was a dear friend by the name of Cristobal Aldrete. Cristobal Aldrete came home and talked about about that case. So from the time in 1948, my parents were telling me about Gus Garcia, the famous lawyer who was part of the Hernandez case. Brown v. Topeka came along. Well, the other thing that happened after the Hernandez case was that all of a sudden my father was on juries, because the Hernandez case was a jury case. And all of a sudden my dad, you know, would always have to go serve on juries. And there were about 4 or 5 Mexicanos who served on juries no más, you know. And anyway, then...
So what did your parents do, if you can?
My father was, when I was very young, he was a meat market manager for one of our major stores there, and then he became the manager for the meat market at the air base. And at that point, our financial fortunes got a little bit better because he was working for the government and civil service. My mother was a stay-at-home mom until I must have been about 12 years old, and then she went and worked in retail. And she was very good at it, you know. They were, as I said, they were very aware after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education. They said, okay. I also remember one of the things that shaped me profoundly was that in about 1954, shortly after that, the talk was that the African Americans were going to be coming to school with us. And I remember that we went, there was an alley behind my house, and if you went down that alley, you got to the Negro school, because that was what it was called. It was called the Negro school. We used the word Negro at the time. And so a whole bunch of us kids decided we were going to go see the Negro school. And I remember we got there, it was during the summer, hot as can be, in a Del Rio summer, and dábamos descalzos, and there were stickers all over the place, and we went over there. And I remember going up to the window and looking in, and it was the most deplorable it was a one-room schoolhouse. The desks had to have been hand-me-downs from the hand-me-downs from the hand-me-downs, and made such an impact on me. Even though in San Felipe we had hand-me-downs for everything, we were a very poor school district. They had the hand-me-downs from us, and it just, I just felt like it was so wrong. Also, about 1952, our school district was going bankrupt. This school district that had been formed by the community, we didn't have a tax base, so it was going bankrupt. So they had this contest of queens and princesses. And pues, guess who won the princess contest? Okay, of course, And I guess it just made me, I remember that to me it wasn't about the dress. It was about, God, I had responsibilities. So it's all, it's just one to grow up in this community, affirmed. Everywhere you turned around, you were being affirmed. And then to see inequality so stark that, and then, finally, you see it in the schools. You become a professional, and you see the inequality, and you decide either you're going to accept it or you're going to want to do something about it.
And so, like, growing up in this environment, it seems like you were a child that was very aware of what was happening. How did that impact your relations with, for example, Anglo students or African American students? Like, did you have interaction with them at all, like a lot, or not really?
Well, no. San Felipe was ethnically isolated, if you would, segregated, whatever you want to. It was an ethnically pristine environment. So, but we were. My family was what I later came to call, in some of my writing, a bridge family, in that my family had interactions with Anglos. And what you knew was, I guess I grew up thinking, there are always a few Anglos you can trust, but with the others you got to be careful. And frankly, that stayed with me it's stayed with me for the rest of my life. It took me a long time to trust. African Americans were very interesting because there were very few African American families in our community. One in particular was an extraordinary family, the Blanks, and their father, or their grandfather, was named Orozco Blanks, and he spoke Spanish as well as we did. And I suspect that this family had probably been among those families that had moved to Mexico and then come back after the Civil War. So we had wonderful relationships with them, and I never felt any barrier, with African Americans.
And now that you mentioned the role of the Spanish language, if you can tell us what was your relationship to the Spanish language growing up and being educated, like in the school settings, and you're saying that it's a very strong ethnic community that you grew up in. So what was the role of the Spanish language?
Well, it's interesting because I was a concurrent bilingual. Both my parents spoke flawless English. My aunts, I had a number of aunts that did not speak English, and they spoke flawless Spanish. And my grandmother spoke flawless Spanish, and fairly sophisticated Spanish. My father's family was from Coahuila, and they were part of that group of people who emigrated during the Revolution. His mother had a connection, was related to Carranza, and Tu Madero. And so they were they were pretty sophisticated. My father's father had had some college, and the only thing of possession of his that survives today is his dictionary. So they were, and so what I had growing up in my family environment were these incredible discussions in Spanish that were philosophical in nature, that were political in nature, that were historical in nature. And then in the school, do you need to shift tapes? No. No. In the school, they abided by the rule of the state of Texas that prohibited the use of Spanish in the schools. But in the community, we spoke both. And Del Rio was very interesting because there were quite a number, I would say a very significant number of the people who lived there were people who had come over during the revolution. And they came over, I mean, we had people who had been lawyers, we had people who had been physicians, the people who had been businessmen. So they came over with, first of all, a strong intellectual tradition and very liberal. All of them were very liberal. And then I also grew up in the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church was interesting because, of course, I read the Bible in Spanish and English before I went to first grade, because I learned to read the Bible in the church. And I mean, they used to show me off, you know, because I could go and read one and then read it in English, and I was, you know, this sassy little kid. Anyway, I can't believe anybody could stand me. Anyway, but the language, I loved Spanish and I loved English.
So you pretty much grew up bilingual.
Bilingual,
right? So what would
concurrent.
be your advice to people who are bilingual currently or in the future, you know, for bilingual generations?
Well, let me finish just telling the story. When I was about in second grade, my parents received a letter from the schools. And the school was telling the parents not to speak to the children in Spanish. And my mother read the letter, and she waited for my father to come home. And she said, "Mira nomás." And so my father said it, and he says, "Idiots!" And I guess that's what I would say to anybody, you know. Only an idiot walks away from an opportunity to know two languages. That was what my dad believed, and that is what I believed. We could spend 3 hours, a 3-hour interview with my relating all of the ways in which Spanish has facilitated my ability to serve my country. Mm-hmm. I was a delegate to the United Nations Conference for Women in 1980. I served on the Inter-American Children's Institute of the Organization of American States for 2 years in the 1970s. I served on the Early Childhood Committee of the Organization for Economic and Cultural Development in Paris, France. I addressed conferences at UNESCO in Paris. In all of those situations, I was an official representative of the U.S. government. And in all of those situations, I used Spanish to do my job better. I wish I knew more languages. And maybe in my old age, I will learn one.
Wow, that's very impressive. I know you have a son, right?
Mm-hmm.
So did you teach him Spanish? Like, did he grew up being bilingual too?
He is bilingual. He is. It was hard. When he was very little, I was doing very well, and then this little blonde girl who lived next door said to him, "Only people from Mexico speak Spanish." So he kind of stopped, but I found a school where he could speak, he would be taught in Spanish. It cost me up the gazoo, but he became, he took Spanish all through his elementary years. And then he didn't speak it for a while. He had an extraordinary receptivity to it. And then he just started speaking it when he became, I think he must have been about a junior in high school when all of a sudden he just took off. And he speaks it fairly well.
Nice. So we're seeing that Spanish has a really important role in your life. Can you tell us how do you personally identify as Hispanic, Latina, Chicana, or if you ascribe or not to any of these terms?
You know, I was part of the Chicano movement, Hueso Colorado, you know, I was there. And we had a really hard time with the label. The elders did not like it. In many cases, I believe that it blocked our ability to communicate what we were about. I think it still does. It was very necessary to use that term at that time.
Can you tell us why, for people who don't know much about the Chicano movement in the U.S.?
Well, you know, we had been called everything under the sun, but it had always been somebody else's choice. We used to have to fill out census cards, and the question was, do you say you're white, or, well, you had a choice between white and Negro. Those were the only two choices when I was young. And then you had, then you were called Mexican, you were called Mescan, you were called Latin American. My father always refused to use the term Latin American. That's why Latino's a little difficult for me, because he always said, I'm not Latin American, I'm Mexican, you know? So what I said after I turned 50, I said, I am never going to tell a young person what to call themselves. Every generation has to find the term that meets their context and that allows them to find their voice and make it heard. We chose the term Chicano as a way of self-affirmation and self-identification with a cause. Chicano was a political term. It was not a cultural term. It was a political term. It was saying, this is what I stand for. I believe that culturally, if somebody asked me, I would say I was Mexicana. I feel very comfortable saying que soy Mexicana. That is the one that most identifies me culturally. But I am a red, white, and blue, loyal, patriotic American, and don't you forget it, okay? Because indeed, in all that context of advocacy and consciousness, it was about Thomas Jefferson, and it was about Abraham Lincoln. And, you know, my wonderful dad, who never had a chance to get an education, would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and read, and he read biography. He loved biography. And, you know, he read, and he would share that, you know, he would talk about those things. And so when I was looking at Thomas Jefferson, I was saying, he's talking to me. And so I just, I feel very comfortable with this not duality in this sense that it's half and half, but it's that 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to make sure we get to some questions.
Go ahead about the case.
I mean into your life in general. So I read on your biography that you went to undergrad at UT Austin.
Right.
And so I was wondering what was your experience there, and if that was different than going to high school and middle school here, and how that impacted your ideas, how it shaped or not.
UT Austin was not a very welcoming place.
Tell us about it.
Okay, it was. There were about 280 Mexican Americans, and maybe a sprinkling of maybe another 100 young men and a few young women from other Latin American countries. We were very close. We had a lot of fun together. Great parties. But it was not, there was one girl, one Mexicana, who was in a sorority, and her dad happened to be on the Board of Regents. But there was not a lot of inclusion. I wanted a degree in journalism, and the Daily Texan wasn't very inclusive. And my teachers, I remember one teacher said to me, "Miss Cardenas, the problem with you is that your Spanish is interfering with your ability to write." Because she wanted me to write simple sentences. She says, because Spanish, and she wasn't being that racist. She said, because Spanish is a very complex language, so you tend to think in very complex ways, but for newspapers, you need very simple sentences. Anyway, it was the other reality of going to UT Austin was that I was very young.
How old were you?
I was 16. And so my, and socially, I was not very confident. I didn't go, if I got invited to a party, I wouldn't go because they were going to drink beer, and I was afraid. So anyway, but I made some wonderful friends that remained for life. Then I moved on. I went to Chicago. I looked for a job in public relations.
So after undergrad you worked?
Yes, I went to Chicago and I got a degree. Well, in those days, if you were a woman and you had a college degree, they asked you how fast you could type.
How fast you could type?
Yes.
Okay.
So the question was, how fast do you type? And I went to, my first interview was with the American Bar Association, and the director of public relations said that women should be at home taking care of their children. And I said, sir, I have no children to take care of. Anyway, but I had an interview with the director of the Office of Information, which was different from the public relations office, and she hired me on the spot. And I worked at the ABA for 3 years, and I had experiences that would fill another interview for 3 hours, but I'm not going to go into them.
Yes, and after that, did you go to graduate school to
No,
Massachusetts?
what happened was I was 19 years old at the ABA, and my one of our projects was the Foreign Visitor Program. And one day, a Latin American jurist came in and I blew his socks off. And after that, I did all the foreign visitor program. Anyway, but we also, it was the thick of the civil rights movement. And one morning I woke up, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I said, what am I doing in Chicago? When the only thing I ever wanted to do was to change things in Texas. So I came home, and I had always sworn I would never be a teacher. But when you get to Del Rio, Texas, and you have a degree, and you're not a nurse, the only thing you can do is teach. So I started teaching, and I fell in love with education. I fell in love with the kids. I thought it, you know, but I saw that something had to change, because I was teaching high school sophomores, and some of them didn't know how to read. So I just felt like there had to be answers that I couldn't figure out. I did some really creative teaching, and I was a pretty good teacher. But so I went to UT to start a master's program, and they weren't answering any of my questions. And I got a job interview, because I had to support myself, with the Southwest Educational Development Laboratory. And I went and interviewed with a man named Jose Angel Cardenas. And Jose Angel Cardenas didn't have a job for me at the time, but he was presenting testimony to the Yarborough Senate committee hearings the day I interviewed. And he said, well, what do you think I should tell them? And I proceeded to tell him exactly what I thought he should tell them. And of course his name was Cardenas, and mine was too. And he was Dr. Jose Angel Cardenas, and he was so brilliant. And when he called 2 months later to see if I wanted to come to work for him, of course I said yes. So I left the master's work behind, and I went to work for him. And that was, I went to work for him on January the 19th, 1969. And in 1969, we had the first large Mexican-American Civil Rights March in Texas, and it was in Del Rio. And I coordinated from Austin to Del Rio all of the strategy with the legislature to try to get as many legislators to back us up. And then shortly after that, and I met Senator Joe Bernal, who would change my life too, and Henry Caso, and then I met a woman named Rosie Castro. And Rosie is, we met in McAllen. We were training, I was doing the training for a project she was going to be on, and we stayed up all night and talked politics. So anyway, Jose hired me, and a couple of months later, he went and asked for a raise for me, and they wouldn't give it to me. So he was pretty angry about that. And then he got a call that the kids in the Edgewood School District had walked out, and they were looking for a new superintendent. And would he take the job as superintendent? And Joe Bernal, Senator Joe Bernal, was encouraging him to take the job as superintendent. And I remember he said, "What do you think, Bambi?" And I said, "Well, it's very tough. You know, they don't have any money." And then Joe Bernal said, "Well, if we can't make it work in Edgewood with a Mexicano superintendent and Mexicano students and Mexicano parents and a Mexicano board, what the hell are we marching for?" So I said, let's go, Jose. So Dr. Cardenas asked me to go with him to Edgewood. And we started innovating like crazy. When we got there, we had an million budget, and within a year we had a $16 million budget.
Was that a result of the South
No.
Texas
No.
initiative?
This is way before me. Now
that.
we're talking
okay.
1969, okay? The Rodriguez case, which is inequity in K-12 funding, had been filed. And I remember Jose asked me to write his first testimony before the legislature on inequity in K-12 school funding. Anyway, we did all sorts of incredible things, and we became a national model for teaching Mexican-American children. We got funded for something called an experimental schools program. We got $10 million. And I still have that proposal, which I wrote on yellow legal pads. Anyway, before too long, the University of Massachusetts heard about our work, and they heard about me, and they invited me to go be part of their doctoral program.
Really? They
Yeah.
just sent you a letter saying
Yes, they came.
So
okay?
you didn't actually like apply to different.
Oh, no, no, no.
Wow.
And when I got there, this is the thing that,
Uh-huh.
and that was, the UMass experience was extraordinary. It was, the place was education and revolution. What their program was about finding people who were already leaders and getting them credentialed. So when I got there, the week that I got to UMass, the newsletter of the School of Education's headlines were, doctoral student gets funded for $10 million. So I kind of had it a little easy. Anyway, it was very, very stimulating. They brought a lot of minorities, and they brought people from all over the country who were doing. And there was a lot of money at the time. It was, the Johnson administration had pumped a lot of money into innovation in education. So it was very, very exciting time. And then I got my doctorate, and I got the Rockefeller Foundation recruited me for a program. They were trying to develop leaders who could negotiate Washington, D.C. So I was one of 4, and I went to the office of Senator Walter Mondale. And Walter Mondale had come and visited our programs in Edgewood. And I had a choice between going to work for Edward Kennedy or going to work for Walter Mondale. But I liked Walter Mondale because he was doing work in child development and in educational equity. So I went to work for him. But I was pretty much low man on the totem pole. The Rockefeller Foundation was paying my salary. I did have a doctorate, and I was kind of cute. But I was not, those places are very competitive. I mean, very competitive. And Senator Joe Bernal came to visit Senator Mondale, I'll never forget. And I want to put this down. I want this to go into history because I don't want it to die. Joe Bernal came in, and the senator's chief of staff came over to my little cubbyhole, and he says, "Bambi, Senator Joe Bernal is here, and Fritz would like you to go in and be part of the meeting." So I walked in, and Joe gave me a hug, and I sat down, and then Senator Mondale says, "Well, we're awfully glad to have Bambi here with us." And Joe Bernal leans over to him and puts his hand on his knee, and he says, "Senator, she's our star." And from that moment on, I was no longer low man on the totem pole. I was there in everything, and the senator, he invited me to be part of his campaign staff when he ran for vice president. I went and I did that. one thing about working in the Senate, when I went to D.C. in 1974, the week that Ronald Reagan was being, not Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon was being impeached, there were 4 Latino congressmen. There was Senator Joe Montoya of New Mexico, Henry B. Gonzalez, Kika de la Garza, Edward Roy Ball from California. There was at the time, I think it was Bobby Garcia from New York. And then there was the representative from Puerto Rico who was a congressman, but not really a congressman. And there were about 8 Latino staff in the whole Senate and House of Representatives. And I was the only woman who was a staffer. There were a few women who were secretaries. And I mean, we could meet in a telephone booth, but we got a lot of support from the United Auto Workers. And the United Auto Workers was very close to Mondale. So we got some legislation through that was focused on our community. But the only reason we were able to get it was because the United Auto Workers helped us, and they had a lot of power at the time. Anyway, I was in D.C. With Mondale, and then all of a sudden he said, well, my fellowship was coming to an end, and he asked me if I would stay on as his staff. And I said, Senator, I love you to death, but I need to get home to Texas. The only thing I ever wanted to do was to make changes in Texas, so I've got to go home. And he said, I understand. So I came home.
So it was always in the back of your mind that you wanted
I wanted to come back to Texas to work. I came home, and Jose had formed something called Texans for Educational Excellence, and its purpose was to look at inequity in funding. And the IRS went after him, and they never gave us our 501c3 status. So we then dissolved Texans for Educational Excellence, and we formed the Intercultural Development Research Association. And there was a program that would give us enough funding to survive, and I wrote the proposal, and we hired 12 of the brightest young people you can imagine, people like Albert Cortés and Aurelio Montemayor. I mean, just super, a team that you wouldn't believe. And we started doing training. And then we did the advocacy work, and we worked on funding inequity in K-12. But we were working with Al Kaufman and Norma Cantu and my lawyer. Anyway, with all of the MALDEF team, George Corbel from Texas Rural Legal Aid, and all of that was coming together. And like I said, it was U.S. versus Texas, was going back and forth in the courts, and then it was out of those discussions that I remember very succinctly when we first said, we need to apply this, but to higher ed, because if K-12 was inequitable, higher ed was, overwhelmingly inequitable. But then what happened to me was that Mondale got picked by Jimmy Carter to be his vice presidential running mate. And they called and said, Bambi, we'd like you to be on our staff. Can you come? And they said, how much do you need to live? And I said, well, the only payment I have to make is I just bought a new condo, and it's $365 a month. But other than that, I don't have any. They said, okay, we're going to pay you $365 a month and all your living expenses. So I took off for the campaign, And then we won. And shortly after that, they called and Dick Moe called and said, Bambi, you need to be part of this government. What do you want? And I said, oh, well, I'd like to be director of the Office of Child Development. He said, oh, everybody wants that. And I said, well, look, Dick, I've always said, I don't need a job. I want to work in Texas. This is where I'm needed. He said, well, I'll call you back. And he called me back a week later, and he says, Fritz, which was what they call the senator, says you ought to be the director of the Office of Child Development. And so at age 32, I led all of the children's programs in the United States, and I was managing $1 billion budget. So I wasn't part of what was going on here around the thing. I get reconnected to it, as I said, with that commission, and then eventually, of course, a lot of things happen in my life, but my mother has Alzheimer's. My marriage ends. I have a child.
I have a question about
Okay,
that. Can I
yeah,
ask?
sure.
Yeah, because it seems
Because
you
I don't
were
know how
so-
much time we have, but
I mean, I'm just imagining at the time, you were the first Latina and then woman for very high level positions. And so I was just wondering what that was like to balance your personal life. I mean, I don't know, were you married? When did you get married? When you had your son? And if so yeah, I just want to know what your family life looked like while you were doing all this incredible work, because it's not the same for men and women.
right. Well, I pretty much, I guess I want to say this too. They were pretty wild times for young women. They were difficult times for young women. It was difficult, particularly for Latina Mexicanas, to navigate the sex roles, if you would. I was very blessed. That's the only word I can use. I don't use it lightly. Because when I started to roll out, if you would, when I went from, it's very interesting how I went from being kind of a ghost writer for Jose. There were these two hippies. They were Anglos. And they told him they wanted to work for him in Edgewood. And so they worked for about 6 weeks, and then they came in and they said, you say all these things, but that's not what's happening down on the ground. And he asked the secretary to call me into the office. And he said, I want you all to meet Bambi Cardenas. And he said, she's my alter ego. And Jan said, you sexist pig. I said, how dare you exploit her? And you know what Jose Cardenas said? He said, you are right. Bambi, from now on, everything we do together, and everything that is written is co-authored. So this must have been about 1970. So after that, everything was Cardenas and Cardenas. And we went all over the country, and we talked and gave presentations and participated in this commission and that commission, and it was always the two of us. Now that created some interesting dynamics. Half the people thought I was his wife or his daughter, and for some reason another half thought I was his mistress. None of which was true, okay? But it did some interesting things, because when I was going out and I would be in these environments, nobody would dare. I mean, I remember walking, I'll never forget, we were in Newport Beach, California, and I walked we had gotten there, Jose said they were going to meet at the bar, walked up to the bar, and the minute I walked into the room, all the men stood up. I mean, they were gentlemen. Y me querían mucho, You know, here I was, this young girl, and it was Juan Aragon, a PhD professor at the University of New Mexico. It was Charlie Leyva, PhD professor at UCLA, the Olivares. The only other woman in that environment was Marilucy Ulivari, who later became Marilucy Jaramillo. She was a PhD at the University of New Mexico, and she was a little older than I. Well, no, she's about 15 years older than I. But anyway, and we were the only two women in all of these meetings where we were doing all sorts of things, meeting with the Commissioner of Education. We formed the National Educational Council de la Raza, which I've got all the documents for. But I was protected, if you would. I was shielded because everybody had so much respect for Jose, and they couldn't figure out what our relationship was. Like I said, they either thought I was his daughter, his niece, his wife, and some thought I was his girlfriend, and none of that was true. So early on, I had that protection, but what I realized also, I was a pretty strategic thinker. And I saw many young women who were taken seriously for a little bit, and then they misstep in their gender role, and all of a sudden they were, because these guys that were all in power at the time, they were like old school and new, they were old school and new school at the same time, and they hadn't figured it out. So if you had a girl who had too much fun, she would be a joke the next day. So I handled that, by being very careful. When I was in the Carter, because what happened with when Mondale got me appointed, and I was 32, I was just 12-hour, 16-hour days. There was no time to even think about,
So how old were you when you got married? And then when
well, I got married at 33. I got married a year after I was in D.C. And what happened was I met the man who would become my husband. We were coming back from Washington at Christmas time, and 4 different people introduced us. And by this time, what was interesting was that a lot of the young people who had been walking the streets, and being part of the Chicano movement, many of them had moved into positions where they had some influence, and they were beginning to surface within bureaucracies. And my husband was assistant city manager in Austin. And he was just a really, really, I guess the reason that I married him was that he was the kind of guy who decided he wanted something and he made it happen. He was just, a lo que vine, vine. And I guess up to then, I had intimidated. It was intimidating to most, at least to most of the Mexicanos that were my age and were available. They were pretty intimidated with this 32-year-old woman who's running a $1 billion budget and has a PhD in 1977. But Andy was not intimidated. He was going to get what he wanted, and we ended up getting married, and then I had thought I would never marry. But my mindset was that I would never marry.
How did he convince you?
Well, honey, he just, he was from the east side of Austin. He had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He was as smart as could be, and he was just a real strong personality. And he just, I admired him. And, you know, it just,
Was he very supportive of, I mean, your career just kept growing from there?
he was, career-wise, he was extraordinarily supportive. I think that it was difficult for him, and that probably is what set us apart. In 1980, our son was born, and that was the year also that Carter appointed me to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And that, the Odyssey, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Odyssey, was very hard on our marriage, and it was very hard on me. I was appointed in early 1980. Our son was born in 1980. I was confirmed by the Senate around the summertime because both of these positions were Senate confirmation. And then Ronald Reagan was elected in November of 1980. And at that point, we knew that it was going to be a hard haul. Because the commission position was not one that you automatically resign. In fact, but the commission was designed to be an independent commission. And it had been created in 1957 at the urging of Lyndon Johnson. And there were 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And the objective was that they be an independent commission to serve as a conscience of the nation on civil rights issues. Well, I couldn't say no to that, you know, when they asked me to serve. Anyway, the Reagan was elected in November, and then about February, I got a call from Reagan's White House personnel office asking me if I was going to resign. And I said no, that I would be serving in the tradition of commissioners that had served before me. And then about 3 years passed with 2 years, with the Reagan White House trying to get me and 2 other people, myself, Commissioner Mary Berry, and Rabbi Salzman. They were trying to get us removed. And the Senate would not allow them to do it, the United States Senate. And it was a national fight, and I was in Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it was very, very difficult. And finally, on my birthday, trying to think, it must have been about 82, I got a phone call telling me that the president was removing me from the commission. And the next day, Mary Frances, and that afternoon, they called me early in the morning, and that afternoon we, how much?
We're good.
Okay. That afternoon, I flew to Washington, D.C., and the next day, Commissioner Berry and I filed suit against Ronald Reagan and his Justice Department for exceeding his powers as president and violating the independence of the commission. And we were represented by MALDEF and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Mary Berry is an African-American woman. And we prevailed. We went into court, and in federal district court in Washington, D.C., and the court issued an injunction preventing the president from removing us. And the reason is that this is important. I mean, it really wasn't about a job, you know, but the notion was that the commission was designed to be an independent commission, not a political commission. And on 3 different occasions, the Supreme Court had ruled that a president does not have the power to remove a member of of a commission with quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative functions that was intended to be independent, because in the words of the court, you cannot be independent if the Damocles sword of removal hangs over your head. So if a president has the power to remove a member of an independent commission, they can't be independent by definition. So what occurred then, and this is all documented, and we were basically reinstated, but the legislation creating the commission was up for renewal, and the White House said they would refuse to sign the bill reauthorizing the commission if the president didn't get his picks. So Lloyd Benson came up with a compromise, and he said, okay, we will take the commission, and instead of it having 6 members, it will have 8 members. 4 will be appointed by the president, and 4 will be appointed by the Congress. The president will appoint 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The Congress will appoint 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The House will appoint 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, and the Senate will appoint 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. So I was reappointed by the Senate, and I served on the Civil Rights Commission until 1992. It was 13 years of service altogether.
Mm-hmm. And so can you tell us about your journey into becoming the first Latina president for UT Pan American?
Yes, that is the subject of our interview, right?
Yes.
Well, as I said, while I was serving on the commission, it was very, very stressful. Literally, I would either after any meeting, I would either come home ill, or Mary Berry would go home ill. One of us, it was just very, very difficult. And my marriage ended. There was, at the time, I was approached to run for the state senate, and there was quite a bit of money that was ready to support me. But I opted not to run for the state senate because I didn't want to be on the commission and be worried about the impact it would have on a Senate race. I wanted to be independent. And then my marriage, I knew, was not doing well, and I didn't want to be a public person when that happened. So Andy and I separated, and I went to work in Washington, D.C. for the American Council on Education. And there were some interesting things that happened there, but let me get back to your question. My mother went with me, and I had my son. And my mother began to exhibit signs of dementia. And it was very clear that I would not be able to take care of my mother and my son in D.C. and meet the job. I mean, it was talk about, being in a difficult circumstance. My dad had died. My mother was needing, and it was very expensive. I mean, people just have no idea how expensive it is to live in D.C. And so I was a single mother, sole support. And so I decided I needed to come home where I would have more of a support system. And gratefully, Jaime Chain found a situation for me at Texas State. But I never intended to stay in higher ed. But I liked teaching. I wanted to teach principals. I wanted to teach people who would become principals. K-12 is my first love. And so after a couple of years, there was an opening at UT San Antonio. And I applied for the job, and I got the job. So I was an associate professor teaching ed leadership in the College of Ed. And UTSA was having a lot of problems at the time. It was very chaotic, people were very unhappy. And some La Raza faculty, some very young faculty members, first of all, the College of Ed wanted, the Division of Education wanted to become a college, and they held a retreat. And they said, we want to become a college. And I said, well, if we want to become a college, let's figure out how we become a college. You know, we've got, what steps do we have to take in order to become a college? Maybe we won't be a college next year, but maybe 5 years from now we'll be a college. Anyway, a lot of things happened at UTSA that are worthy of historical note, but the upshot of it was that Ricardo Romo eventually became president of UTSA. And that's a whole other story. And he'd been there about 2 months, and he decided to form a commission to reorganize the university. And he asked me to head it up. And so I began the process, and I began applying all the things that I had learned about how you do this, how you create consensus and input and all of that. And we had a very, very successful process by which we got something like 90% of staff and faculty at UTSA had direct input. And we ended up with a massive reorganization of the university. And among those, we created a College of Education. So we had a College of Education. I'd done my job as a commissioner. I was never going to stay in higher ed, you know. My life was not, I'm not a scholar. Never thought I was, you know. I'm a teacher, but I'm not a scholar. And I mean, I'm an action leader. So I went off to Italy with my son, and all of a sudden I get calls that the provost wants to talk to me, and they want me to be the dean of the College of Ed. And I'm saying, oh, no, I can't do that. There's a perfectly good person to do it. Anyway, one thing, some time passes, and eventually they suggest, I become dean of the College of Education. And in 4 years, we took the College of Ed from 0 external funding to $10 million. We took teacher success on the certification exam from 84% to 99%. You know, we just did it very methodically. And so then...
was this during the...
No, the commission, I had resigned. I mean, in 1992, my term was up, and it was one day after George Bush Sr. left office, and Bill Clinton had been elected, and I said, okay, I'll let Bill Clinton appoint the next one. So, and to be perfectly honest, my mother's Alzheimer's had advanced considerably, and I needed to hire somebody to help her. And so I made the conscious decision to hire a person who was not documented. And it was the best decision I could have ever made. You know, she was wonderful with my mother. But I knew when I hired her, I knew that I could not go back for a presidential appointment. I was asked about being assistant secretary here, assistant secretary there, and I declined because that would have come up, and that would have you know, it was, and they never checked on the men, but they would always check on the women. So I just walked away from the government career. Now, I was approached about making congressional runs, but I opted, I had my son, and I had to take care of my son and my mother. So, you know, I wasn't going to go off and be a candidate. Anyway, I was at UTSA. Miguel Nevares declared that he was not going to, that he was resigning, and I got recruited left and right. But I didn't think that they would hire me because here, because I had filed suit against Ronald Reagan and won. And this was a Republican Board of Regents. And I'd been a part of the Chicano movement. Never thought they would hire me.
So you were surprised then when
Yes. Yes. I was and I wasn't. I was because I thought the politics would go against me. But I wasn't, because when I talked about what I wanted to do with UTPA, I could just see them eating it up. So anyway, I ended up as president.
And how was that experience? Can you tell us some highlights, or what were some of the biggest achievements that you felt that
I will
happened?
tell you what was the most grueling, and this has everything to do with the court case. Juliet Garcia and I would go to those Board of Regents meetings and sit there. And they were passing out money left and right, and we never got any.
Why?
Because we were not part of the PUF. The Permanent University Fund, it was dedicated to the Texas A&M system and to the UT system. We were part of the UT system, but when the case was settled, they said we were not eligible for PUF funds. So we got monies, but we didn't get monies, okay? But we got monies, we got to go to the party, but we didn't get to sit at the table. And so here I was, back in the same situation, you know, with knowing what we could do. I mean, what we did at UTPA in those 4 years, almost 5, we increased graduation rates. We increased the production of engineers. We went, for example, this is one that I'm really proud of. When I got there, we had about 150 kids who had internships. When I left, we had over 500. We had the highest rate of study abroad participation of any institution in the UT system except for UT Austin. On every indicator, we showed tremendous progress. And that, first of all, I taught leadership. Secondly, when I was at the American Council on Education, we were training presidents with the best management and leadership gurus in the country. And then I had grown up in San Felipe, so I knew how to live with less. So you took all that I did at UTPA was basically take those principles of management and leadership and apply them, and we documented everything. We were documenting everything, and people were getting excited about seeing their accomplishments recognized. The other thing that I really was a very strong believer in was in decentralized authority, because every management principle, you know, tells you that decentralized authority, putting as much authority as you can at where the rubber meets the road is going to give you the best results. So my sense of accomplishment at UTPA is I feel very good about it. Now at the same time, we had to live with the fact that our funds were still minuscule compared to the funds in the other institutions. And let me tell you why, and it's really important that anybody who's looking at this case understand. There's the issue of the PUF money, and then there's the reality that higher ed institutions are funded on the basis of a formula, okay? And that formula gives more money. For example, a freshman history credit hour might give you $1, but a freshman biology credit hour would give you 23 of formula funding. A doctoral biology hour might give you 73. Well, guess what? UTPA and UT Brownsville, and probably a number of the other, we were spending all our time offering that freshman history class. And then 50% of our students were flunking out as freshmen. So that 1 hour was never, 1 hour freshman hour class that was giving you $1 was never going to become a $6 junior class credit hour. So the formula was, I didn't explain it very well. The formula was working against us. We didn't have the programs that give you, we kept buying hamburger and we were never getting to steak, okay? So in the first place, the money wasn't flowing. The money wasn't flowing to create the programs. So if you don't have the programs, the formula doesn't give you the money to build them up. And it's just so clear. You know, what I've learned about equity is that you follow the money. And if you want to turn inequitable situations into equitable ones, you have to understand how the money flows. Now, what we did, what we accomplished, given our small amount of money, is a miracle. It's a miracle of the determination of the students, an incredible staff, and a lot of dedicated faculty. But we also ended up sometimes with people that we had to take whatever was available because we didn't have the money to pay for the best.
And while you were president, what was your role for the South Texas Border Initiative?
Okay. The South Texas Border Initiative provided some funding for some programs, but I was not, the supplemental money was kind of running out, and the legislature was going to an incentive-based funding model. And the incentive-based funding model said, here are some indicators that are important to us, like graduation rates, like minority participation. By this time, the South Texas Border Initiative was very much on the back burner, and the coordinating board was working on something called Closing the Gaps. And Closing the Gaps is a very important program because it's not a matter of closing the gaps, let's say, between blacks and whites or Hispanics or Latinos and whites. It's closing the gaps is closing the gap between California and Texas, or closing the gap between Massachusetts and Texas, making Texas as competitive as Massachusetts or California. Well, California has how many flagship institutions. Okay? Massachusetts has more flagship institutions per capita than any other state. So if we were going to close the gaps between Texas and those other states, we had to close the gaps between groups. Because Texas cannot close the gaps between itself and California if it continues to maintain the gap between Mexicans, or between Latinos and whites, or between African Americans and whites. It just doesn't have enough whites. That's just the way it is. I mean, we make more babies, okay? So, so if Texas is going to be competitive for the long haul, so my job, okay, at UTPA was to show evidence that we could close those gaps. And it's like we would say to other institutions, if you want to catch fish, you have to go where the fish are. So if you want to increase the participation and the success of Latinos in higher education, you're going to have to go where they are. Okay, it's just that simple. So that was, that was pretty much the extent of the role. My focus was on increasing graduation rates, and I'm glad we did it.
The principle. Okay, so it seems that you had a lot of achievements. Did you have any barriers that you faced during your time there as the president?
As the president, yes.
Can you tell us about that, and what were your strategies to overcome those?
It was very frustrating. There was a mentality that let me put it this way. I had, in 2007, after being president, it ended up I had a blockage, and I needed open heart surgery. So my assistant called to Boston and said, Dr. Cardenas is going to have open heart surgery. And they said, oh, well, is there anybody down there who can do it? And Carol said, yes, there's a very good doctor down here who's going to do it. Well, the week that I did it, the heart hospital in McAllen was chosen as the heart hospital with the best results in the state of Texas. Okay? And Dr. Filemon Rodriguez was considered the best heart surgeon. But the mentality in the system was that, do they do open heart surgeries down in the valley?
Like nothing good is from
nothing
the
good
valley.
is here. We, there was a problem at one of the institutions with something having to do with malpractice in one of the health offices, the student health offices. So immediately the system says they're going to audit all the student health offices. And the first one they choose to audit is UTPA. Well, guess what? There are only two, but we said we've just been audited by the National Society, whatever, for student health offices, and we got an A rating. There were only two institutions in the whole UT system that had that national certification. One was UT Austin and the other one was UTPA. But their assumption was that if there was a problem in the system, it had to be here. And we could probably give you 30 other instances where that notion that somehow we were not good enough, and it wasn't a barrier. I guess we go back to San Felipe, okay? Growing up in that ethnically affirming environment, I've never been stymied by personal discriminatory treatment, although I'm sure that it's been in my life, but I just don't respond to it. But institutional discrimination, I'm so aware of. And it's because I see the disparities. And of course, then the impact of those disparities on individuals. We start with, we got one interstate highway to the south of Texas. I mean, the way this state and this country has distributed the monies that Robert Kennedy made a statement that not 1 cent of the money that belongs to all of the people should be used in a manner that perpetuates discriminatory treatment between groups. Well, you know what? It is the ideal, and we should keep it in mind. But there is evidence everywhere that tons of cents of the money that belongs to all of the people is used in ways that perpetuate differential life outcomes for different groups. And that's what was obvious to me when I was 6 years old, and it's obvious to me when I'm 72, and it'll be obvious to me until it changes.
Yes. So I was thinking more on like a personal level. So as I was preparing for this interview, I Googled your name, and I came across this Inside Higher Ed article, and it was talking about your retirement and some dissertation allegation things. So if you can tell us about this moment in your life, because it also said that you were battling your heart condition as well. So I feel like these were many stressors coming from multiple places. So I just wanted to know, like, how were you feeling at the moment, and what did you do, to like overcome these hard times, in a sense?
My son is very brilliant, and he is very insightful. And when you are in the public arena, and if you're doing anything, if you're not doing anything, nobody goes after you, If you're doing anything, somebody's going to go after you. And the more you do, the harder it is. This was a very hard thing. It was very hard because I had no defenses. I could not explain the context of my work at UMass and the spirit of UMass, which I'm proud of and grateful for, and its impact on the way in which my dissertation was prepared. There was just no there. And the pressures were very, very, very hard, very strong. But my son said something to me that I proved to be true. And he said, "Mom, your reputation is not that fragile." And it's true. First of all, we are not our job. The job is not who we are. Our work is not even who we are. We are something more than our work. We are how we have chosen to live in the world. So, and then secondly, one thing does not mark your reputation. The people who know who you are know who you are. And I have been blessed with an extraordinary level of love and affection and support by this community of mine. So you go on. And in an interesting way, I said to Dr. Garcia, it was a liberating experience. You know, when you're a kid, you're afraid that something terrible is going to happen to you. And the terrible thing that you're afraid of is that your parents are going to die. And then when you become a parent, the terrible thing that something will happen to your kid. So we are all afraid of the terrible, whatever the terrible is. But if you walk through the terrible, when you come out on the other side, you're free. So in some ways, I think about it as a life lesson that made me I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
Do you think it was more of a political thing? Because of, you were so political from the beginning of your life and career. Do you, you don't have to answer that question. I'm just thinking if there was like a political
No, it was very
it.
very clear. I fired about 5 or 6 people who needed to be fired.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it was partisan. And I think that perhaps it would have been handled differently.
If it was a man, for example?
If it were not the president of UTPA. Yeah. But frankly, I had worked too hard. I wanted UTPA to be proud of itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't going to fight and put it through an ordeal.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, because we don't have much time left, but I was wondering if you could tell me what are your thoughts on the importance of collecting oral histories, specifically from people here from South Texas, and if you have any advice for young Latina women or just anybody who might be first generation that are committed like you to serve the United States or their communities in general. If you had any words for, people that might want to follow this leadership path.
Well, on the first issue of the oral histories, we have had three people whose history should have been recorded just die recently. Very dear people. I've been encouraged greatly to write a memoir, and I find it it's just like such a self-serving concept. I have great difficulty with it. But then I see so much history that isn't the way I remember it. That sometimes I think maybe I'll get around to writing it if I get angry enough sometime. Or where there's great big holes. For example, the National Education Council de la Raza was a spectacular thing. And I don't think, let's see, Jose Angel Gutierrez and I and Ed de Avila were the only ones left. Marilucy was a spectacular thing. Anyway, so yes, the oral history, do it as much as you can, as fast as you can. The advice or the counsel for anybody, when your life is dedicated, if you have a choice, you can be career driven or you can be purpose driven. If you are career driven, you can lose it all, even when you thought it would never happen. When you are purpose driven and you have been true to that purpose, nobody can take it away from you. So I would say probably the only thing I would say to a Latina woman is get a better balance than I did. I wanted to have 6 children. Well, obviously I couldn't have 6 children, the things I did. But I would have probably balanced that out a little bit more. So try to find some balance between the personal life, the personal happiness, personal agenda, and the purpose-driven life. But I've told somebody I'm enjoying being insignificant. Being insignificant has its perks, but being significant, that's pretty good too. So
But you get to experience both.
Right.
People only. Well, just one last question since we got interrupted. So why did you accept to do this oral history, to participate in this oral history project?
Well, just because I think Maggie's doing wonderful work, you know, because I don't know, maybe it was I've lost a few friends whose stories needed to be told. And this is a good way to do it, that it doesn't just... I've always said that if you're a teacher, when you teach, you become immortal. Because what you teach lives on in somebody else and then in the lives that they affect. And they affect them. So there's that immortality that occurs, and if you teach, it doesn't matter whether your name remains, because what you did is goes on. And but I get very anxious because my darling husband and I did find true love eventually. And I married a man that I admire greatly and who is my media naranja in every sense of the word. Rafael was Jose Cardenas's best friend, and Jose was my hero and Rafael was his hero, so I ended up marrying my hero's hero. And he he went to UT in 1945, and he and a group of veterans who came back from the war started a group called the Alba Club. And the Alba Club did this was from about 45 to 48, and they demonstrated and they held citizenship classes, and they were an advocacy group at UT Austin. And Rafael was the first president. And what I've done several times, is I'll have all of the ones that are still living over for dinner on his birthday. And it's interesting because if you read some of the histories, or you read an obituary, and they will say, he was very proud to have been a member of the Alba Club. Or Banji a friend of theirs just recently died, and the obituary said she was very proud to be part of the Alba Club. Terry, Joe and Terry Long Center in Austin. Terry was a part of the Alba Club.
Oh, wow.
And so the question, and there, that history, we need, and I keep saying we need an oral history of that. We need an oral history of that.
Invite us to dinner next time.
and then I said to myself, and sometimes something will happen, and it'll trigger a memory, and then that triggers another memory, and then I think about all those memories in my life, and there's so many that are very significant. I didn't talk about the May 25th memorandum or Lau v. Nichols or any of those things, okay? But they're very significant. And I was privileged enough to have been either a principal or a part of a group that was important to that. And so when that memory is triggered, I think, how do I make sure that people know about it? Because it is informative, so that people don't make the same mistakes, you know. Anyway, I think I need to go.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much
Sure.
for your time and sharing your story with us.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.